Since they sailed here, European colonizers and their descendants have been removing black South Africans from their land. But 100 years ago, law and not war would force a native population out of their homes and off their land. The 1913 Land Act said to move millions of black people and the few belongings they could carry to just 7% of the country.
Awakening on Friday morning, June 20, 1913, the South African native found himself not actually a slave, but a pariah in the land of his birth. So Plaatjie was a man of all seasons, court interpreter, journalist, historian, cultural icon, monarch, was my great-great-grandfather.
Plaatjie journeyed across South Africa on a bicycle, writing stories about the hurt and loss of ordinary people by laws designed to divide the nation. It was in this brutal winter that he met a young family forced off their farm. Loading all they could onto a wagon, they left but had nowhere to go. The road was long and many of their animals didn't make it. And after just 2 days in the unforgiving cold, their baby too fell sick and died. Traveling on whites-only land, they trembled with fear because even stepping off the road could see them jailed.
This young wandering family decided to dig a grave under the cover of the darkness of that night, when no one was looking.
Black people suddenly found themselves being pushed into a small corner.
Without that building block in place, it wouldn't have been possible to put in place apartheid.
Plaatjie also met a widow named Maria and her 3 children, who brought life to their land, planting seeds and harvesting crops, giving half their produce to a Dutch farmer. But the Native Land Act made black tenant farming illegal. Black people could only live on white-owned farms as servants or farm workers, forced to give up their livestock. At a time when most farmed for a living, it was an economic assassination. And when Maria refused, her home was set alight.
Maria, with her bedclothes on her head and on the heads of her son and daughter, and carrying a 3-year-old boy tied to a bag, walked off from the farm, driving her cows before her.
But this was just the start of a systematic impoverishment of a nation.
You began to see other legislation that then began to affirm and suppress the black people.
If you look at the history of legislation, you'll see 1913 Land Act set in place those segregated areas. 1923 dealt more strictly with the rural areas. 1936 was the extension of the Land Act, different kind of provisions, entrenched segregation very deeply. 1950 Group Areas Act, a seminal date in our history, because that said, if you're black, you live here, if you're white, you live here.
In 1936, the wastelands black South Africans now called home were extended from 7 to 13%. But they were still ploughing the country's hardest soils and were only allowed to enter farms and cities as temporary workers. In the climate-controlled vaults of the National Library, you'll find maps illustrating the segregation. By the 1960s, black South Africans had not just lost their land, but also their citizenry. 10 ethnically defined Bantustans or homelands were created. These were separate countries, led by chiefs, but controlled by the apartheid state. democracy opened the doorway to return land to South Africans, but no one knew how difficult this process would be.
So Plaatje finally ascended to higher service in 1932 after immense contribution towards his people. If he was still alive, crisscrossing this country on his bicycle, what do you think, what stories we could have related to at present day?
Land restitution isn't just about rebuilding homes and giving back farms. It's about pain, loss, and acknowledging the human suffering of the young family who lost their child, or Maria who lost her home. And now more than ever, it's about regaining dignity. Yusuf Omar, Johannesburg.